works on several on several scholarly communications and digital scholarship projects for Educopia. And before joining Educopia, Brandon worked for several years in digital scholarship at Michigan State University, and he has an MLIS from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MA in American History at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. So without further ado, I'm going to pass you over to Brandon. Thank you, Brandon.
Great, thank you, Jane. And I should be sharing now. Thank you, Jane, for inviting me to this talk, and thanks, Jane and Ava, for organizing all of this. Thank you to all of you who showed up late in the afternoon. As Jane mentioned, I was project manager for the Library Publishing Workflows project. Since then, I've been the assistant facilitator for the Library Publishing Coalition, where I'm continuing to work on some of the workflows things. We're kind of keeping it open to other possibilities, curating other documentation, things like that. I work with a lot of other scholarly communications projects. Just for some context, I want to talk a little bit about LPC, or Library Publishing Coalition, and Educopia Institute, which is my employer. The LPC is a community-led membership organization that includes academic and research libraries, as well as a few library consortia that are engaged in scholarly publishing in some way. It was first formed in 2013 and 2014, so we're almost 10 years old. And currently we have about 85 members, most of whom are in the US and Canada. Since its founding, LPC's primary goal has been to serve as a community hub for library publishers. In other words, to be a space to develop best practices, to formalize the field of library publishing, and also, especially in the early days, to kind of try to formalize the profession of library publisher. Also, you'll have to excuse me, I'm feeling a little under the weather, so I may have to pause for tea or coughing. I also wanted to add that that LPC has lots of resources for non-members, including the annual Library Publishing Forum, which is generally every spring, a set of curricula for people to learn more about the pillars of library publishing that's called the Library Publishing Curriculum, an annual directory of library publishers around the world. And that, I think, starting last year, we now collaborate with the IFLA Library Publishing Special Interest Group, so that it used to be, again, primarily US and Canada, but as of last year, it is worldwide. And in addition to those things, we also have a bibliography of research in the field. And there's also a public listserv you can subscribe to. There's a short form on the librarypublishing.org homepage if you're interested in joining that. And then Educopia Institute is LPC's nonprofit host. And as an organization, we host several other communities, primarily in GLAM fields, primarily scholarly communication and digital preservation, but not limited to that. And we also consult with projects and organizations, again, primarily in the GLAM world, though not necessarily exclusively. Excuse me. So the Library Publishing Workflows project got its start in the LPC. And it came about through the recognition that library publishers develop their services in response to local needs and sort of idiosyncrasies. And because of that, the workflows they use are generally homegrown and sort of like patched together based on the technology they have, the people they have around, what the expectations of the journals are, things like that. So they tend to be really kind of like very different from one institution to another, and it makes it difficult to have conversations with each other about how to improve workflows, how to make changes and improvements, or just kind of generally have conversations, right? Because everyone is very different and based on these local needs. And on top of all that, these workflows are generally not available to people. They're rarely documented at all, and when they are documented, they're not shared outside of organizations, again, generally. So a lot of conversations about workflows either happen like with a quick question on a listserv, or in a conversation at a coffee break at a conference or something like that. It's not really a community-wide conversation for the most part. And this makes it difficult for the community to grow and flourish. It means that new library publishers don't have examples to follow and are left figuring out things for themselves. It also limits the extent to which best practices conversations can take place. And it also limits opportunities for the folks who develop the tools and platforms we use, and the service providers who take part in the workflows to identify and understand common pain points and gaps, just again, because there isn't really that conversation happening. So the goal of this project was to jumpstart this conversation by creating a cohort of partners and creating a set of documentation, and then really trying to use that to seed broader conversations about workflows and where problems are and where things can be streamlined, and more or less just what library publishers need from this. So the Library Publishing Workflows project was funded by the Institute of Museum and Library Services, the federal funder in the US. And it ran from 2019 to 2022. You may notice that aligns pretty perfectly with COVID, which has, it really changed a few things that we did. We needed an extension, but altogether, I think it worked out really well. Yeah, so the project itself is a partnership between Educopia Institute, again, the host of LPC, LPC itself, and 12 partner libraries in the US and Canada. The libraries were selected to represent a broad range of libraries that are publishing academic journals. We have a small liberal arts college. We have a couple of large state schools. We have a historically Black college and university consortium, HBCU, it's a term we use, and an Ivy League school. So we were very careful to get really a broad view, different types of libraries, and libraries that are at different stages and sort of scopes for their publishing. Some of them only publish one journal, others publish 30, 40, 50, and we try to hit a lot of numbers in between just to get a broad variety. We did scope this project to only study the ongoing publishing of journals, while recognizing that all of our partners publish more than just journals. Some of them publish monographs, they publish theses and dissertations, some of them publish open educational resources. And we also recognize that a great deal of even journal publishing work falls outside of the ongoing publishing workflow. Things like onboarding new journals, training and orienting journal editors, migrations to new platforms, and so much more. So we had to recognize that we were really just kind of getting a sliver of the work that these librarians are doing. So we spent the better part of the last 3 years creating and eventually publishing documentation about our partners' publishing workflow. In addition to this sort of core work, right, developing that documentation, we've also been publishing blog posts on things like pain points, which I'll talk about more later, and the ways workflows evolve. And we've also been convening conversations about different platforms and tools. And a lot of those conversations have been open to the entire LPC community, so not just our cohort. And again, we really want all of this to be a bigger conversation about what publishing looks like in libraries. And this is just an attempt to kind of seed that conversation. You may have already noticed, but I have a link to all of our deliverables on the slide. I think I probably have that link on half of these slides. So everything we have is listed there sort of in order of release. So I encourage you to check out that link to read more. Excuse me. I want to talk a little bit about the interview process and sort of how we came to create the documentation. We started off with interviews with each partner about their workflows. But before we even started those interviews, we sort of learned our first lesson. And that's that library publishers don't have like the workflow that they use. Different journals at the same organization often operate slightly differently. So most of our partners either had one sort of generalizable workflow that looked a lot like, the various different journals, or they were able to identify a few different workflows to discuss. So I think about half of our 12 partners had more than one workflow that they documented. Once we were able to identify which workflow or workflows our partners wanted to document, we encouraged them to get everyone who touches these workflows in a room for an interview. And this proved really helpful, as everyone has a different perspective just based on their role within the library, the work that they do on the workflow. And it also just helped to kind of remember things that happened that our single point of contact may not have remembered. For the interview, we asked our partners to focus on a single issue and then share first when the library first encounters the article. So usually, at submission, when the library stops actively working on it. So in that case, it's usually when it's handed over to preservation, and then identified each of the major phases it goes through in the process. And then we talked through each of those phases and identified each step of the phase. So even though we had these 1 hour in-depth interviews, the documentation process, it turns out, was only just beginning. So after those interviews, I reviewed the recording and sort of wrote everything out to the best of my abilities, identifying the phases and just writing out all the steps as clearly as possible. And then for each partner, I just passed that document back and forth several times, giving more and more revisions. And this process ended up being really helpful to clarify skipped details that they had skipped or steps that they had forgot. And I also think that my lack of familiarity with their process, being outside of their workflow, was also really helpful, because I just had a lot of questions, and we helped to identify a lot of areas that were not fully described. So that is my when I encourage people to do their documentation, I always push to find someone outside of the publishing world, or find someone in your library that's outside of library publishing, or find another library publisher to review these, and you can get a lot more detail, a lot more clarity. After we landed in a good place with those, I created diagrams, and I will share examples of those in a moment. And the same back and forth happened. And once we shifted to diagrams, we ended up going back and making more changes, because that sort of like shifted the way that people had viewed the work. After that, we then had a couple of rounds of focused reviews and revisions with different groups of the cohort. So again, we spent this whole process from interview to publication was probably close to 1.5 years, which is more than most people, I think, can probably afford to do on their own. But those mini rounds really were helpful in finding more detail and offering more clarity. And it also, a lot of our partners mentioned that it gave them a lot more insights than they had previously had, because they were continually engaging with like what's happening, why they do it, what are some of those details, and they really started to see their workflows in different lights. So one of the major things that we've shared throughout this project is pain points. There's a poster from the Library Publishing Forum, I think 2020, where I go into more depth about the pain points, but I just kind of wanted to share some of the things that we found here. We published a pain points blog series where 4 of our partners talked about some of the more in-depth, more of the common pain points in depth. And those were aging infrastructure, the challenges of scaling up, funding, the perpetual problem, and quality control. So in addition to those blog posts, throughout the interview process, we documented over 80 different pain points, and found that most of them, not all of them, but most of them kind of came back to these 3 original sources, which are copy editing and typesetting, a lack of library control over the process, and staffing. 1 second. So copy editing and typesetting probably speaks for itself. There's a lot of manual focused work. Not all of our partners did that in-house or even had that as part of the workflow. In other words, not necessarily everyone did it, had someone else doing it. But yeah, it's a lot of focused labor, which can really bog down the process and take up a lot of librarian time. The existing software was insufficient, particularly for things like mathematical equations and things like that. Those take a lot of work to do. There were some problems with the publishing platforms. Almost all of our participants used either Open Journal Systems or bpress's Digital Commons. And those platforms had little or no functionality in that area. Some of the libraries did outsource it, but that costs money, and getting that money and being able to pay that out was a challenge for some folks. The next one is a lack of library control. This is sort of like an interesting problem, and we didn't have a great way to describe it. But basically, because this is, it touches so many different people and is so collaborative, that it can be difficult for the libraries to have a lot of control over where and when they're allocating their time. And it's also a challenge to make changes to the process. So, throughout the process, the library shares responsibilities with partners, including editors, vendors, and freelancers when those are included. And each of those partners may have a different mission. They may have different goals for the process. They may have different priorities. The library workloads and timelines are often dictated by others and may vary between different journals. So oftentimes library publishers are picking up existing journals and those editors already have a process that they want to continue using. So if you pick up 5 different journals, then you may be picking up 5 different processes that you have to kind of adapt to. And another thing that they said was just like a lot of editors will, especially when the semester ends, they'll go through their backlog. So suddenly there's 20 articles that the library has to deal with. And after, weeks or months of no work. So it's really hard to sort of manage those workloads. And there's not a whole lot that they can do besides ask the editors to be more steady. And then the final sort of primary source of those pain points is staffing. This is probably not super surprising to anybody. Often there's only 1 or 2 staff working on journal publishing. And even among those, they often have to do other library duties. They're, working, managing the institutional repository. They're the ScholComm librarian. They're doing outreach. They're trying to, open up other open access opportunities, things like that. It's also, it can be difficult to fill roles if a staff member leaves. And then when they do leave, the training and onboarding takes a lot of time. So whenever there's turnover, it can really slow things down. Sorry. So moving on to documentation. These are a couple of snapshots of the finished products. There's a lot of information on in this documentation. It's not super conducive to webinars. I think it's something that it's really beneficial if you're able to sit down with a couple of examples and really dig through them. So I would again say, if you're interested at all, I'd recommend going to the link that is on lots of these slides and actually, download the documentation itself and take a look at it. But I'll try to talk about what the documentation looks like, what the different pieces are, and where there's some variability. Each partner has 3 pieces of documentation, which you can see here. The first one is the diagram, this actually has 2 diagrams and a detailed workflow, but there's also a program profile, which I'll talk about here. So these program profiles add a lot of important context to the workflows. So we had our partners answer things like how many staff they have, the total number of journals that they publish. It's also an opportunity to document all of the work the publishers do that isn't reflected in this workflow. I know I mentioned that earlier, but what we kept running into is that there's a ton that goes into publishing a journal that isn't necessarily just on the article in, article out process, like that part of the workflow. So I thought it'd be helpful for other readers and for our partners if they're making a case to their administration, to have some documentation that shows like what their total scope is on the work. The next piece are workflow diagrams. These diagrams are intended to give you a bird's eye view of the workflows and see who's performing the bulk of the labor for each step. So you can probably barely see it in this screenshot, but each of the steps has a little or one or more little colored rectangles, so you can see who is performing each of the steps in each one. It also helps you kind of see from a bird's eye view what types of work the libraries are focusing on, what they're doing, what others are doing, where their priorities are. I really love looking at the diagrams with multiple workflows, like the first one especially, and also the third, because they really show when libraries are doing multiple workflows where they overlap, where they share steps, and where they diverge. And I think the first one is especially interesting because it shows that some workflows share some steps with, like there aren't a couple of different types, like some share, some steps with others, and I don't know, I'm not describing that well, but there's a lot of variance there that I think is really interesting. The last piece of the documentation are structured structured workflows, excuse me. These have a more narrative style and include a lot of the details and contingencies that aren't included in the diagrams. They're just like simply too much information to have in a diagram. So that's all the documentation that we released, and we released that, I believe, at the very start of this year or the end of last year. And then this spring, we also released a set of documentation and reflection tools. So when we started this project, we knew right from the start that we wanted to release documentation tools, so resources for people to create their own documentation. But as the project went on, we realized that we really wanted to focus on the use of the documentation. We encourage people to branch off of the work that we've done and make documentation that works for their needs, because there are lots of different reasons to do documentation, and one sort of set of practices or template doesn't work for everybody. So we created a set of tools to help people reflect on their workflows and identify areas for change. It can help them evaluate other programmatic changes, like if they want to scale up or scale down, or even just think a little bit more deeply about their processes. The first two tools are intended the documentation tools are intended to help them document their own workflows. The first one is, it's called Documenting Your Journal Publishing Workflow. And this is a guide and a set of templates to creating the detailed documentation about your journal publishing workflow. So this includes like the questions that we used in our interviews, and guides on basically what I was talking about before, is like the more revisions you can do, the better, the more outside people you can talk to, the better, that sort of advice. Yeah, it walks you through the questions you should ask yourself and your colleagues, or a partner if you're working with one, about the work that goes into a journal article or issue. The next of the documentation tools is called Diagramming Your Journal Publishing Workflow. And that's a step-by-step guide to creating the diagrams themselves from that initial documentation that you've created, including some more things to think about as you try to visualize your work. And then there's some also templates and tool libraries that you can use in diagramming software. It's a little bit harder to use than I had expected, especially if you want to get everything perfectly right. So we have advice for the nitty gritty, but also kind of the rough version, how to think about that and how to create it. Then for our reflection tools, we have 4 of these. The first one is called Are Our Values Reflected in Our Workflow? And that's a tool for gathering your library publishing program's values. If you've written them down anywhere, and reflecting on how you see them embodied in your workflow. This was, I think, one of the most interesting conversations that we had in this project, was that one of our rounds of review, we had our partners ask each other, like they'd look at a set of documentation and ask themselves, like, what is this library's priorities? So they would try to look at like where they were really focusing on, where they seem to be putting their resources and time, and then echoed that back to the original partner. And I think that was really illuminating for a lot of people to hear sort of like what their workflows were saying about their values, which are not always what you have identified your values as, right? So I think that's a really useful practice there. The next one is our work sustainable and scalable? That is a tool for gathering your publishing program's values and reflecting on how you see them embodied in your workflows. Oh, sorry. The sustainable and scalable is a tool for reflecting on the capacity and cost of your workflows and understanding how much money and time you're investing in the workflows. This is a challenging one for a lot of our partners because they haven't really written out, how much time goes into each step, how much, what percentages of employees go into that, what some of the external costs are. Again, a lot of people are using external services, service providers, different platforms. So our goal was that with that was not necessarily to like have a price tag on every journal, but allow them to to stop and reflect and say, like, how many more journals can we take on at this point? Like, if we take on 2 more journals, do we have to hire another person? Like, if we take on 2 more journals, do we have to stop doing some other work? That sort of thing. We also we have a great blog post from Isaac Gilman at Pacific University, kind of about this. From the time that our project started to the time that it ended, Pacific University actually stopped publishing journals. I think they actually still publish one student journal, but they were explicitly shifting to focus on monographs and no longer do journal publishing. So there was he wrote a really great blog post about how their priorities have changed and how they have how they've been making that shift and why they decided to do that. So I'd really recommend that one. The third of the reflection tools is what standards and policies are we using? So that is a tool that lists a lot of really broadly used standards and identifies policies that many publishers have, and tries to identify where they're enacted and where others could be enacted. So there are COPE has lots of guidelines on things like making changes after the fact or retractions, how to do peer review, things like that. Not everyone has formal policies for those. A lot of them just kind of like have an internal understanding of what happens. So we tried to identify as many of those standards and practices as we could and set those out there just so that people can take a look at those and try to determine if that's something that they should try to include or or not, or if they need to make changes to their existing policies. And the fourth of our reflection tools is what other documentation do we need? So I think I've mentioned this a couple of times, but we found that with our scope being just the process or the workflow that a single issue or article goes through was very limiting, and that there are tons of things that happen outside of that workflow that it was people really wanted to include them. They really wanted to talk about what it's like to onboard, what the training process looks like. In one case, we actually made an exception because the onboarding of journal editors was such a process, such a part of the process of publishing a single year's worth of journals that we included in there. So there are a few different variations that we did use. But yeah, we found that a lot of the other work that people do aren't necessarily documented. And in going through this process, they were identifying all kinds of areas that they wanted to get get written down for various reasons. So this is basically just a parking lot to take note of the things that have come up, and find other documentation. Have a place, a list of other documentation that you need as soon as you're done to get started again. I wanted to sort of make sure that I was recognizing everyone who took part in our project. As you can see from this list, there were tons and tons of people from each of our partners that helped out in this process through interviews, through revisions, through reviews. We also had an incredible advisory board that really made a lot of that really helped us formulate our final ideas and help guide us where we were going. Also wanted to recognize the team at Educopia, including the principal investigator, Melanie Schlosser, the co-PI, Catherine Skinner, and our comms and administrative support team. And I don't have a slide for this, but I did want to add one more thing that since we've released these, the documentation and the documentation tools, we've had 2 workshops on just intended to get people in the room to sit down and take the time to write these things out. And what we found is that it's just incredibly hard for people to be able to allocate the time to do this documentation. We have these workshops, and when it comes time to do them, like, people usually leave the workshop. When they stay in the workshop, they get things done, then they return to work and they aren't able to get them finished. So I just want to recognize that, it's really important work, but it's also really difficult work. And especially it's something to keep in mind as I keep pushing for lots of revisions and reviews, that it's really difficult to be able to set aside the time to do this work and to get this done. But we've already heard from several of our partners that as there have been transitions in their libraries, that it was really helpful to have it. So it is a big time investment early on, but it can really save a lot of time later on, and really make those things go more smoothly. So with that, I think I have wrapped up my presentation, and I'm happy to take questions now.
Thank you so much, Brandon. That was a fascinating presentation and a brilliant project. And there's so much